Production funding for Behind the Headlines is made possible in part by the WKNO Production Fund, the WKNO Endowment Fund, and by viewers like you. Thank you.
Early voting has begun, what school buildings will be closed, and the impact of guns in Memphis. Tonight on Behind the Headlines. I'm Eric Barnes with the Daily Memphian. Thanks for joining us. I am joined this week by a roundtable of journalists talking about some of the biggest stories of the week. That includes Toby Sells from the Memphis Flyer, excuse me. You got hung up on the word Memphis already.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Laura Testino, a reporter at the Daily Memphian. Thank you for being here again.
Yeah, thank you.
Along with Julia Baker, who covers criminal justice and public safety for us at the Daily Memphian. So thank you all for being here. We'll start without Bill, which is scary, but we're going to talk about elections and early voting. And I've written down a lot of notes. Bill can do this without notes. I cannot. But early voting has begun as we tape this Thursday morning, but it began on Wednesday and goes through October 31st, obviously Halloween, and Election Day is November 5th. In 2020, early voting accounted for 78% of the total 384,000 votes. You can learn more about where you vote, what's on the ballot. We're going to talk a little bit about that and dig into some of the issues on the ballot. All that, you can get it on the Daily Memphian, you can get it on other news sites. You can also go to shelbyvote.org and get all where to vote early, where to vote on Election Day, all much more detail about this. But I'm going to just do a quick summary, and we're going to drill down on the gun referendum, which in Memphis at least has gotten probably the most attention. The federal, obviously the presidential race, Senator Marsha Blackburn versus State House member Gloria Johnson is a big race. Steve Cohen and David Kustoff, the U.S. House of Representatives, are up without a whole lot of opposition, honestly. In the State House, all 13 districts that cover Shelby County are up for re-election this year, or election, I should say. State Senate, 2 of the 5 Senate races that cover Shelby County are up. And then the suburbs, there's a whole host of races in 5 of the suburbs. That includes 2 mayor races, that includes education, it includes aldermen. You can get all that, again, at Daily Memphian, Shelby Vote, or other news sites. Only Arlington of the suburbs doesn't have races. But the big one, and I'll bring you in here, Toby, the big one that people have focused a lot on for all kinds of reasons, both the content of it, the potential ramifications of it, is the 3-part, the ordinances around guns. I'm going to summarize very, very quickly as one vote, one referendum is require a handgun carry permit within the city limits. Another would ban the possession of an assault rifle without a permit, but only then it'd be on one's own property or at a shooting range. And then allowing seizure of guns under an extreme risk protection order. That is about a page and a half long on the ballot. But those 3 have been incredibly controversial. We've talked about them here. We've had, give me your take on it, and we'll talk a little bit more.
Just the drama. This summer when the city council was deciding whether or not to put these things on the ballot, even just to put the question to voters, they knew that it wouldn't do anything, just to say, let's ask the question, let's basically poll, city voters, see what they think. Boy, that caused headaches, from Nashville to East Tennessee, with these lawmakers threatening to pull state taxpayer dollars for Memphis for even putting this on the ballot. Leaders of the House and Senate weighing in on these things, and that was just a disappointment. There's got to be a better way to fix this problem. I have ideas, but and then to say that we're going to go ahead with it and put this on there, so they're triggers, right? I mean, they're kind of trigger laws. If things happen, then these laws go into effect.
The cities, and J.B. Smiley, who really pushed this, the chair of the city council, was on the show some weeks ago. You can get it at WKNO.org. He said, in a way that I had not fully grasped, honestly, until I talked about it, even though I'd read it, that, look, this is not unlike other laws, abortion laws particularly, where a state has put laws in effect that can't supersede the federal law, but when Dobbs went through, when Roe v. Wade was overturned, Tennessee's law kicked in, and that happened in other states. How J.B. Smiley and others view these they can't usurp the state laws around guns. They know that. But they could sit there if there was a change at the federal level or at the state level. These would then go into effect.
That's right.
The legal mechanism about it.
Yes.
Back to you.
And I wrote a whole story earlier this year about who's got the power, right? The state government loves to tell Memphis and Knoxville and the big cities what to do and what they can't do. Frankly, we tried to decriminalize marijuana in 2016 here. The state said, "You can't do that. Our law says you can't do that." We didn't. Other things have gone in other cities, but the state government loves to fight the feds on everything and anything. That's kind of what our Attorney General Jonathan Skrmetti, he loves to get in those fights and go there. So there's this constant struggle about what we can and what we can't do. And so a lot of these the things on the referenda, I suppose. Our city council trying to roll back some of these big gun issues that have come from the state legislators. And the idea that I had, I see this go all the time. I'm from rural Tennessee, and I see this. There's no communication between what cities need and what suburbs and the rural parts of the state need, and they don't hear each other at all. I would love to see some kind of rural urban committee where we just sit down and talk about these issues for real. We're going to vote on this stuff. If it gets 100% of the vote on all these things, nothing changes. Nashville's going to say, I say Nashville, state lawmakers from, more rural parts of the state are going to say, look at that woke garbage they're trying to do out in really liberal Memphis, and they're not going to do anything about it. They're going to think, well, great, we're doing our job.
And I should say, it will be an interesting measure of people's sentiment. We did a poll a year ago. There have been polls done statewide that people do want what is kind of generally referred to as common sense, pretty overwhelmingly some amount of restrictions, some amount of limits. There are obviously nuances and differences of opinion on that. I'll also say that we have rarely in the last few years had any politician of any background who didn't want some amount of restriction on guns. And that includes Bill Gibbons, a lifelong Republican, former DA, head of public safety for the state, who would like to go roll back some of these kind of the openness that's been done. So I don't want to say that there's another point of view. I'm sure there are people listening who have a different point of view, but the overwhelming amount of public officials, law enforcement officials, and the polls have shown that people do want more restrictions in Memphis, Shelby County, and that and they're frustrated.
Right.
So,
and you can almost put a data point to that. When they passed the guns in cars bill from the legislature, law enforcement officials were way against that, almost across the board. And then you saw gun crime with stolen guns go up in the state. It's
and again, virtually every law enforcement person, from DA to police director to all public officials, have likened that, have talked about that. Why are there so many car break-ins? People are looking for guns by and large. Which segues to you, Julia. You and others on the Daily Memphian staff are in the midst of, I think there are a few more parts maybe to come, on guns, just the impact of guns. We did a look back. I think Bill wrote a look back on just the history, like the permitless carry, guns in trunks it was originally called. I think it was back in 2023 or 2013, excuse me. Talk about some of the ones that you wrote and things you found. I think you did one even that published this week. Was it on switches? Was that you? A lot of people participated, so apologies. Yeah. So talk about what you found in terms of this look at guns. People can get all these articles at dailymemphian.com, but let me turn to you.
There's also the 2021 permitless carry law. Some of our Republican legislators voted against that, like John Gillespie, and I think Mark White voted against that. So that's pretty significant. My story that published today was about gun switches. We've really seen a proliferation of those on the streets. Those are often 3D printed or brought in from overseas. The ATF they did a report last year saying there's been something like a 570% increase in the seizure of switches. It's a relatively new device. Our police department doesn't really track it. We're hoping that they'll really start tracking it soon, but the limited data that we have gotten from them indicates that we have seen an increase of those on the streets.
And the story you did today was on Thursday. Was taking a semi-automatic weapon that might have 10 bullets or something in it. I'm not a big gun person, but you put the switch on it, you can just pull and shoot all those as if it were an assault weapon, as a machine gun. You can also then get you can get 30 or 40 rounds with a different clip. And so it suddenly turns into a handheld machine gun, which, your story pointed to a number of big incidents where many people were shot and or killed as a result of people using these switches.
Yeah.
And they're very hard to trace. They
are.
can be ordered overseas, they can be made, like you were saying. So other stuff in the series included, I think Sam Hardiman did a really painful but really well done story on emergency rooms. He talked Le Bonheur and Regional 1 and the emergency room people there and the amount. We talk about the number of murders and 300 plus, but there are some, over 1,000 gunshot victims every year that are going through the emergency rooms. We do a look back on these bills of who voted for what. We also touched on the arming teachers just this last session in 2024, the ability for school districts to choose to arm their teachers, partly a response to the Coventry shooting. And with that, I'll switch to you maybe for a little bit, Laura, and we'll segue into some education stuff. But obviously school safety has been a huge issue. I think you wrote about that, if I think I have that right.
Sure.
School safety issues and false alarms, and talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. So there was, I guess, about a month ago now, a day where MSCS completely locked down all of its schools. This was over some threats that made it to a handful of schools, and then, eventually the decision was made, we're just going to lock everything down. When we talked to the State Department of Homeland Security, he shared he's been at that department for 5 years. He said that, the number of threats that he's seen since August 1st is the most significant that he has seen. What he did say is that there's not a proportional correlation, though, with how many of those threats are credible. So what's happening is that the department is having to spend a lot of time assisting local law enforcement agencies and school districts in just weeding through those threats to really assess the credibility. That department is less focused on, is there a probable cause for arrest so they can make arrest, and more focused on, is this a legitimate threat? How do we respond to it to keep our students and staff stay safe at schools?
Yeah, and I think you mentioned the Memphis-Shelby County schools shutting down, but I think most, if not all, the suburban schools did, probably some private schools. Because if it seems credible, and given the frequency of school shootings in this country, it is hard for a school district to say, nah, we're not going to respond to that. We're not. And so I can't imagine the difficulty of the decision making that the schools are facing.
Sure. Yeah, there's that. And then, another instance that I wrote about, probably, not too far ahead of that, about a month ago, there was a school in Fraser that was, very much enveloped in the crime scene that developed after a couple of men fled arrest from a car. One of those men was fatally shot by police officers, but that all happened right in front of a school. So you see instances where the school is the direct threat. You also see instances where community violence is just encroaching upon schools, and then the schools have to make those decisions to do soft lockdowns as well, to just make sure that those things don't intersect in a bad way.
Let's stay with schools and shift, though, to about midway through the show here. A lot going on. We had Marie Fagans, the superintendent of schools, on the show a month ago or so ago. You can go to WKNO.org and get that. I thought it was not for anything I did, but it was very interesting. It was great to meet her. It was probably the fourth, or I think probably the fifth superintendent we've had on this Memphis Shelby County Schools, Memphis City Schools, all those successor schools on the show. But one of the things we talked about there, and there's been more movement on this, is school closures, which is just a huge hot button issue for people, for parents, for teachers, for community leaders. You got a community when you take that school and you close it. School officials will look at it clinically and say, look, this school is maybe half full, maybe it's a third full. It has all this deferred maintenance. There are some 200 buildings, most of them schools, but also administrative and maintenance buildings. Where are we in that decision-making process that Marie Fagans touched on, but there's been some more movement since then?
Yeah, so I'll start this by saying, I think people are probably sick of listening of this is coming, this is coming, this is coming. We've been talking about how school closure decisions are coming, consolidations are coming for a couple of years now. We had a plan that, the quick summary is Superintendent Hobson left a plan, retired, COVID happened. Joris Ray updates that plan in spring 2021, presents it. A couple of closures happen, very small things change, and then he leaves. We have Tony Williams come in. She says she's very committed to making a plan that lasts. And now we have Superintendent Marie Fagans, who's opted to have the results of school building evaluation. So essentially there was $1.9 million spent to hire an outside company that does this all over the country to look at and create a database that stays updated of everything from this is the condition of your door and your window to this is the condition of your roof and here's how much it's going to cost. And so what the thing that's changed now is that we have all of those results back. So the school district has all of that data. It hasn't been shared publicly yet, but they know the number. They know the value of the deferred maintenance bill that is expected to be over $1 billion. That would bring all of the buildings back up to par, and they're going to have to look at that. And that's what Marie Fagans has decided to do is use that information to determine consolidations and closures.
And we don't know yet how many she's going to close. It's my impression from what she was able to say when she was on the show is that she's going to close some buildings. I mean, that she's going to try real hard. Does the school board, I think they have to approve that, which gets into local districts and the kind of a little more political. I don't mean that in a bad way. I mean, they represent districts around the. What's the time frame for more decisions being done?
So right now, Marie Fagans has said that she will have that plan by April. School board policy on closures requires that community meetings and votes made about closures happen by February. So closures of existing school buildings right now, less likely if we stick to the timeline for next fall. What could be likely is we see more decisions about consolidation of administrative buildings, which may not stick to that timeline as specifically, as well as rezoning, which is something that hasn't come to the board as often, even those zoning decisions, so like where your address dictates which school you go to.
Not use of buildings, but what district you're in. Okay,
yes,
that kind of
and where what your home school is, for lack of a better word. Yeah.
We're going to come back to some school stuff. Sure. I would encourage people to go and read some Laura's stories, though. There's one that it's just this painful, maddening story about a building that was bought, the Bear Building. The Bear Building, that, for seemingly very good reasons. There was a lot of deferred maintenance in the existing headquarters for the administration. Let's buy this building. They felt like they got a great price. They put $23 million in, but they really need to put another $70 million in. They've only moved 500 people up there. I mean, it's just kind of. As a taxpayer, you just bang your head against the wall, which brings me, Toby, to MATA, which, speaking of deferred maintenance and banging your head against the wall and just a kind of really epic disaster. I mean, that's not even a subjective assessment of the situation. I'm not trying to be biased.
I've covered a lot of boards. I've covered a lot of city governments in my time and watched these people go through, workaday problems, right? So kind of the beginning of the year, our new reporter, Kaylin Johnson, she got on the MATA beat, and her stories were those kind of workaday stories. This problem, this problem, this problem, and all of a sudden it was this implosion. First, it was $60 million budget deficit that was coming for the next year. Wow, any board's going to have an issue there. To fix that, they came in 200 layoffs. They stopped trolleys. They were going to cut bus routes and all these basic services that just really opened people's eyes up. The MATA folks, and I don't, I'm glad they went up there. I'm glad it wasn't me, but they went before the city council and just really got, raked over the coals. City council members saying that somebody knew, somebody was lying here. Just a really tough time before the city council up there. All the while, Mayor Young brought in a consultant group, Transpo, to look, see what happened. That report just came out.
And that is, by the way, if you watch this show on a regular basis, you should at least skim that report. We're going to do a deeper dive on it. I know you all have read about it. You should read everything about it. It's epic. It is, and it's so disastrous.
It really is.
And it shows that this was years and years, if not decades in the making. One of the things that stands out, they bought some 20-something buses from the Tucson system that were in good shape to update the fleet. They've got 21 of them that they've yet to be able to put into service because of just all these systemic problems. The really sad fact, and I don't know how they solve it, situation of very important routes that lose so much money. I mean, none of the system makes money. Very few public transit systems in the world make money.
That's right.
But the trolley line is actually the most revenue producing, but is really more of a tourist thing, and which there's nothing wrong with that.
Right.
It's 80 pages of just sadness, of just like, oh my gosh, this is so bad.
That's right. And again, I mean, if you watch this show, you're into this stuff, go check that report out and it'll just peel your eyeballs back. You know, one of the big things, the criticisms they have of the past MATA board was this budget they just passed. They $60 million deficit, all these huge cuts, all these things, this dramatic budget, and they didn't talk about it at all in a meeting. They just unanimously passed it without saying a word about it, and they thought, you know, the Transpo people thought, okay, there's a problem here. And so we went from that to we saw late Friday, this past Friday, Mayor Young says, you know, I want to, you know, completely reset over there at MATA, and they did that Tuesday with the City Council.
With a whole new board and so on. We are trying to we had her scheduled. There's obviously a lot going on. The interim CEO, Bakara Williams, we think is coming on soon. Maybe some board members. We definitely will be covering this more. With 6 minutes here, I want to come back to you, though, Julia, on a couple things. One is always a huge issue at this table and in the news around criminal justice and public safety is bail releasing. There were some changes, the standing bail order. Let's talk about all that, the changes to the standing bail order, and start with what that is and what those changes are.
Yeah, so the standing bail order was brought about when Just City and other organizations threatened to sue Shelby County for its bail practices and not considering the ability to pay, and it instituted a bail calculator and bail hearings within 72 hours of arrest. But the legislature passed a law this session that takes away the ability to pay from the bail consideration. So we're no longer using that bail calculator. And so the Just City has since sued Shelby County for not using that anymore. So that's one thing that we've got going on. We've also got a new public safety bill that it adds the consideration of public safety in addition to flight risk when a judicial officer is considering ROR on a defendant.
ROR being released on own recognizance, which is one of the things that
bail.
gets people real. When somebody's released on their own recognizance, and many people are, and it all goes fine.
Yep.
But when it happens that person goes out and reoffends, and particularly if it's a violent situation, they're like, how in the world is this person ever released? Right. That's the dynamic that gets people so frustrated.
Right.
Right. So the changes to that.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
So Lead Judicial Commissioner John Marshall recently said during a panel discussion that gives judicial commissioners more teeth when it comes to setting bail. Another thing is that judicial officers can deny bail on non-capital cases, so rape, torture, things like that. That has not passed yet. It passed for the first General Assembly this last year, and then it has to pass another General Assembly for the referendum, and then that will be put on the 2026 gubernatorial ballot.
That would be a Tennessee state constitutional amendment.
Yes.
Yeah. I want to stay with you. We could do a whole show on everything everybody's covering here, so we're moving a little quickly. But two stories you did. First is, and by the way, it's Bakara Malden is the interim CEO of MATA. That's my fault. Apologies to her, and I screwed that up. You did a really interesting story on officers leaving the Memphis Police Department, 134 officers that left in the last fiscal year. I assume that ended in the summer or so. 76 of them did exit interviews that were public, and you called those together and were able to talk to some of the former police officers, and it was a mix of reasons they left. It was very fascinating. And I say the backdrop of that is we have about 1,990 MPD officers right now. Everybody, it seems like every mayoral candidate, every former mayor wants to get us back to something like 24 or 2,500 crime commission, so on. There are people who don't want that, but many people do. And the city has struggled and most big city police departments have struggled increasing their officer ranks. What did you find in those exit interviews and the conversations you had with former MPD officers?
So the top two reasons that officers decided to leave were family reasons and going to another agency. One of the officers I talked to, he really talked about, the level of crime and violence, not just working with the crime and violence, but even just, being affected by it himself. He has a family, and so he moved all the way to Salt Lake City, where they have a whopping 8 homicides, or from January to September, they only had 8 homicides compared to our nearly 250. So that's, a stark difference. Other reasons, though, were work conditions, work hours, company culture, and overall compensation. And so, this May we had the lowest complement that I've seen in my time covering crime. We had close to 1,800 officers. Usually we hover around 1,900. Our city has been wanting to really reach a short-term goal of 2,300. The ultimate is 2,500, but they have not been able to reach that for several years since benefits got taken away in, I think, 2014.
And others had really interesting reasons that they had loved the department, they had loved the work, and they just had whatever reason in their life, they were moving, transferred. It was really an interesting story. The last thing, we don't have near enough time to do this, and you were at the Tyre Nichols trial. Really, 20 seconds, we all know how it turned out. We all have seen or seen parts of the video. What was it like to be there virtually every day in that hearing room?
Yeah, I mean, it was a range of emotions from the family. They were there mostly every day. Anytime video was played, they walked out. I can imagine why. We heard from various witnesses, use of force experts, MPD trainers, people who received text messages from Demetrius Haley, who texted pictures of Tyre Nichols after the beating. And we even heard from one of the defendants himself and one or two of the other.
Which was remarkable that he testified. I didn't give you enough time on that. I didn't give him enough time. There's much more we're going to get to, but we are out of time. That's all the time we have this week. If you missed any of the show, you can get it at WKNO.org, the Daily Memphian, YouTube. You can also get the podcasts wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks very much, and we'll see you next week.